All right. I think we're working. All right, so welcome to Project 6 webinar. So I hope everyone is enjoying JavaScript so far and enjoying our web project 4. So I know it's not project 4, but that is the repository name. So we're actually going to continue to extend and add more features to this project in Sprint 6. And we're adding probably our last major visual feature, and that is validation. So if you take a look at here right now, I have a completed project 6. And you'll notice that everything looks the same. Our image works, our remove, and we can add. Everything works primarily the same. But you'll notice that before, take for example this project that this is a project 5 project. This is what we'll be working on today. But I can make this empty, save it, and it's going to accept that. Right? In a real world application, that's not the best, right? Let's say we're editing an actual user profile here. We of course don't want to allow the user to leave it empty. So we would want to add some validation on here, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. So if you notice, so if we go to first our project instructions, let's take a look at the instructions before I show you the finished product. What we're going to be doing is adding this validation here. So we're going to have the border color of the input is going to change. We're going to add a validation message, and that validation message is actually going to be unique to whatever the actual error is. How are we going to find out those messages? How are we going to find what the error is? We'll talk about that. And here is what, well, I don't need to show you that. We have the finished product. But we have our requirements here. So we have two forms here that we're going to be validating. One is the edit pop-up and the add pop-up, right? So the edit pop-up where they can edit the profile, like the name and the title, and the add where they can add a card by providing a name and a link for the image. So both of those have requirements. So for the first one, that is name, the name field has to be between 2 and 40 characters. And obviously it cannot be empty, so it is required. Something has to be in there, as long as it's between 2 and 40. The about, again, is also required, but it has to, so it can't contain just one character, right? It has to be between 2 and 200 characters. So we're allowing that to be quite big. And it says to use the default error messages of the browser. We'll talk about how we actually get to use that. And the new place form, the title, but first off, both fields are required. The title between 1 and 30 characters, and the image URL as long as it's a valid URL. So how does that work in the future? We're going to talk more about rejects. So what that does is every URL essentially has the same pattern, right? So it's HTTP optionally with the S if it's using SSL, and colon slash slash something something dot something, right? So that is the, right? So although this may not exist, this website, I don't want to press enter because who knows what's going to come up. But this is probably a valid website, right? So this is a valid website, so that can contain an image or who knows what. We're just gonna look at the pattern, and the browser is actually gonna do that for us. So we'll talk about how to do that. Two more features that we're adding. The pop-up can be closed by clicking outside of the white box or by clicking on the overlay. So if I come back to demonstrate that, if I open it, I can click outside to close it, or I can hit the escape button, and that will also close it as well. Same for the add as well. One thing you also notice is we are not able to submit if it is not valid. So I need to have a valid title and a valid domain or URL in order to go ahead and submit that. So that is what we're going to be implementing today. Just as a preface, I'm not going to touch on the actual styling of these elements. And I'm pretty sure you guys can figure out at this point how to make, how to just space it out and make it red. So I'm not going to waste time on that. We're just going to focus on the JavaScript. Depending on how many questions we have, we'll see how far we get. But either way, I will show you guys how to implement this. So to go ahead and get started, I'm going to bring this over here. That's our finished product. And I'm going to start from here, which is essentially where you guys are at. So everything here is where you guys are at. This is pretty much a finished Project 5 without any of the validation bells and whistles. So, in order to do this, we're not going to include this inside of index.js. We're actually going to compartmentalize this JavaScript by including it inside of a separate file. So we're going to come here and we're going to create validation.js. Now, I'm going to include something in here just so that we make sure it is being loaded. So I'm going to put hello from validation.js. I'm going to come back to my project. I'm going to reload this. And as you can see, I find no console.log. Why? I did not actually add the file. I make this very stupid and simple mistake because although it's a very simple and you might say stupid mistake, it's a very common one. So you're probably very excited, you're going to make your validation.js, you're going to get in here, you're going to start writing code and nothing's happening. Make sure you actually add the file. And I say that because it's something I still do to this very day. We're going to continue to refactor our code and put it in different files. We have to make sure that we're actually including it into the actual end page. So go ahead and I'm going to duplicate that and simply, it's the same path and the same directory. So I'm just going to rename this to validation.js. One thing to mention here while we just did that, there is a recommendation here. I highly advise you, especially if you're struggling with the project, submit your project first and then go ahead and give this a shot. I say that because if you give this a shot, you don't do it right, the reviewer isn't going to accept it even if everything else is correct. So like do the extra part after you pass. So don't focus on it, especially if you're late. But if you want to live on the edge, I guess go for it. But I do recommend doing this. But one thing it says is resetting the form validation. So we're not going to do this today. When you close out, if there's errors, you're still going to see it. When it comes, for example, I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. If I come to the finished, actually, they might have implemented it. So right here I have an error. If I close it out and open it, okay, yeah, you'll see that we changed the value, right? So you guys already have this code that does this, but the error is still there. That's acceptable in this project, but it's best if you reset it, obviously, because this error no longer applies. So that's an extra part. Like I said, do that only if you have time, but either way, I do recommend doing it, but after you pass. So I mention that now because if you do go for that, pay attention to the order in which you added this file. Make sure that validation is added last because hint hint, you're going to need to access code inside of index.js. But that's all I'll say on that matter. So let's come back here and let's see if this new file is loading and I get hello from validation.js. Why am I getting disable submit button is not defined index.js? 176. I know why that's happening. They did implement that, but I ripped out the code. But anyway, we're gonna hide that for now. We don't need it. All right, so let's get started with validation.js. I'm gonna reference the project page one more time because they give us starting code here, and this is code that we do want to start with. And I'm going to go ahead and copy, and I'm just going to paste this right into validation.js. So what is going on here? If I come here, I'm going to see an error, and it's going to say uncaught reference error, enable validation is not defined. So it's telling us, well, actually, before I explain, can anyone look at this piece of code, and does anyone know what exactly, you don't have to explain the error, but what exactly is this doing, or at least trying to do? Like, for example, what is this?
It's trying to do an enable validation function with an object passed in.
Absolutely, yeah, perfect explanation. So we're trying to call a function called enable validation, and we're passing in one parameter, and that parameter is an object. This syntax may throw you off a little bit. So what I like to do is do this. So I would like to break this out into, I'm going to call this config, and I'm going to take this object and add it to a variable. And I'm going to pass config in here. Whoops. I'm going to pass config in here. And this is the same exact thing, except the actual object is stored inside of a variable. Now to you this may look a little bit more readable, and quite honestly to me it does as well. But essentially all we're doing is calling a function that actually doesn't exist. We're going to write this function, and we're going to use the information that we're passing into it. So let's go ahead and define this function. So I'm going to define a function, but I'm going to use an arrow function. I'm going to call it enable validation. You know what? I'm actually just going to use a regular function. Enable validation. And I'm going to bring in the parameter of config, and I'm going to log it. Config. And if I do that, so what's happening here? Here I'm defining enable validation. I'm defining then this variable of config. I'm calling enable validation, and I'm passing this into it. And so as soon as I see this, I can come up to enable validation to see what's going on. And what I'm doing is I'm grabbing that parameter and logging it. Now, one thing I want to make clear, although I named these the same, and I suggest you do because it keeps things, it helps you keep better track of things. But I can call this whatever I want. Let's say if I call this options, right? Like it's an options object, right? You can call it whatever you want. But the point I'm trying to make, and you can see I get the same thing, is that what you pass into here is going to become the first parameter of whatever is inside of here. And I say that because we're going to look at another way of kind of using the same flow but a little bit differently with object destruction, but we'll talk about that when we get there. But if I add another parameter here, like let's say for example I'm going to pass in something else. I'm going to pass in just a string of my name. And so options is still options. Nothing changes. But I have another parameter here that I can bring in. And because I passed in a string of my name, I'm going to call it name. Right? So this function is expecting now another parameter of name. And it's going to be the second one. So if I log now name, you see what I get is Julian. Now let's say I do this. Let's say I change the order here. And I pass in my name to string before, and I add config next. What am I going to get? You see what I get is actually the class. Why? Because now the second thing I'm passing in is the object, right? So this is a very badly named variable because it's not actually the name. It should be called the options object. But the point I'm trying to make, and it's very, very important to wrap your head around this, is that what you pass into here becomes these guys, right? So it becomes the parameters that you bring in here. And this is important because you also have to pay attention to the order. But, like I said, there's another way to handle this with object destruction, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So I'm going to bring this back to options, because all I need here is options. I do not need to pass in a useless string of my name. I'm going to take that out, and I'm going to leave this log of options. Alright, and I'll make sure that everything's working, and I am good to go. Alright, so what's the first thing I need to do here? The first thing I need to do is I need to go to my forms, and I need to collect I need to go to the HTML, and I need to collect all of my forms here. And this is important because I need to grab all the inputs inside of those forms, but I need to differentiate where they're coming from. So the easiest way to do this is simply to query for every form inside of my the DOM here. So I can call this form else, right, for form elements, and I'm going to document dot query selector all for the form tags. And let's go ahead and log form else, and let's see what I get. What you see, one thing I get here is I get a type of node list, and that's important because if let's say I log an array, right? So I'll do just an array of one item. This is different, right? This is an array. It's not a node list. So a node list is like an array. It's a list of node items, but it's important to note that it's not an array, although they're similar. There are a list of items, but node list is different. So we don't, in some browsers, we don't get the for each. Okay, we do here. In some browsers, we don't. I think we don't get map. Yeah, so we don't get certain methods on node lists like we do on arrays. So essentially, we're not as equipped with as many tools that we can use on an array. We'll talk more about where these methods come from when we get to classes. But one thing we want to do is we want to convert this to an array, and that's very easy to do. We can call this array object that's built into JavaScript. So right, array isn't defined anywhere. Array is actually given to us by our browser, so we don't have to define it. But we can use a method on this object called array from. And what that does is you'll notice that now when I come back, I get that method of map because this is now an array. But if I log form else, you notice that I have the same items inside of them. The only difference is it's stored inside of a different data structure. And that data structure gives me more options. And it also makes it more browser compatible as well. How do I know how to do this? First off, I read documentation. So this does not magically come to me. Because this is one of those areas where it's like, where in the world would I have ever thought of that? It's just something you're going to get from you know, seeing people do things and, you know, reading documentation and learning best practices. So if you go to array.from and mdn, here we go, it creates a new shallow copied array instance from an array like node list or iterable object. So you can see this is how it's used. So this is documentation, and this is where you would discover something like that. So just so you know where we got that from. So as you can notice, we're getting these two forms. But one thing I did here that's bad is I targeted this by tag. And this isn't phenomenal because let's say I add another form. Let's say in the future, and we are going to do this, we're going to add a sign up and a login form. And I'm going to my document and I'm grabbing every single form tag. This isn't great. I want to grab here, in this case, the form by the class. So like I said, in me personally, I would do something like this, you know, like because I like to differentiate how I'm collecting stuff in JavaScript, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to go ahead and use this class. And I need to put the dot there to denote that it is a class, and I'm getting the same things except a little bit cleaner this time. There's one more way we can do this, and that's by using, again, something that we get in the newer version of JavaScript, and that's we get the spread operator. So if you notice what I did here is if we simply add these brackets, that creates an array. And if you notice, we're logging here an empty array now. And I can put things inside of it. Now, if you notice, array.from, it grabs an array-like object. And that's what a node list is, an array-like object. But what we can do with a newer version of JavaScript called ES6, and this is what we're learning in this course, we can wrap this inside of an array. And because we know that it's going to contain a node list, we can use these three dots here. Dot, dot, dot. And this is called the spread operator. And what this does is it grabs, so it's expecting that whatever is next to it is an array or an array-like object. And it grabs each of the items inside of it and makes a copy of it. It works the same way as array.from. There may be some nuances between it if you get really, really deep into it. But this is the same thing. So if you notice, if we go ahead and again log that out, we get the same exact thing. We get an array with the two items. So this is how we're going to do it going forward, because it's the easier way to do it. It's less verbose and it's a more modern way of doing it. So we have here all of our form elements. So what we want to do with these form elements is we want to go to each form element, right? We want to loop through them, kind of like we're doing with the initial cards, and we want to add the event listener to it, and we want to do some more stuff with this form. So what do you think we're going to do? Just like we did in initial cards, we're going to loop through each one of these form elements with for each. And in browsers that do not have the for each method on the node list, we don't have to worry about that because this is an array. So we don't have to worry about this not being compatible. So we're going to go to form else and we're going to loop through each one of them. So we're going to provide an anonymous function here. And inside, we're going to get past one parameter. We're going to pull in one parameter, and that is the form itself, the form L. Again, so let's log form L. Let's just make sure everything is working correctly, and I should get 2 logs of each individual form. Awesome. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add an event listener on this form element. Whoops. The event I want to listen to is the submit. And what do I want to happen on submit? One, I want to make sure that when this form gets submitted, we do not, we prevent a default. So make sure that it's not, submitting each time. That it's not reloading the page. You know what? So I have to check if this is actually necessary because I think we're already doing this we are already doing this in index.js, but it's a little bit cleaner here because we're assuring that every time we use this for each one of these forms that we're going to validate that we don't let it refresh the page. So next thing we're going to do is, what do we have to do now? So one, let's write some pseudocode out here. So one is we have to look for all inputs inside of form. Alright, we have to look for all the inputs inside of the form. We have to loop through all the inputs to see if all are valid. If any input, or let's say if input is not valid, we want to grab the validation message. Let's say get validation message, and one, we have to add the error class, right, to the input. Add error class to input, right? That's going to make it red, and show, let's say, display error message. So we're going to add that little text underneath the input. So we're going to display error message, and also and we want to make sure that the button, disable button. If all inputs are valid, then we should enable button, and we want to make sure that or let's say reset error messages. Right, so again, this is called a pseudocode, so it's pretty much the logic of everything that we're going to do. In a real world case, you sit here and you think about what you're going to do. So, and this is something I always want to tell you guys, because you see tutorials and you see even tutors like me. I've done this live coding quite a few times. I'm pretty familiar with the project, so I'm pretty familiar with the steps that were going to take place. So this, me just firing out pseudocode, knowing exactly step after step, it's not realistic. You're going to sit there, you're going to think about it, okay, what do I need to do now, what do I need to do here? There's a lot of thinking involved, and you're going to have to plan that out. So if you're thinking to yourself, oh my god, I'm not doing it as fast as he can, I'm never going to do that, I don't even do that. Alright, so this isn't realistic, right? I've done this quite a few times. I don't have to think about this too much just because I've done it a few times. So I just say that because it's easy to get discouraged if you find that you're not moving as fast as maybe the video, or you watch other YouTube tutorials. They prepared, they rehearsed. This right here is probably the hardest part, because you have to find the logic, and now we have to actually translate it into code, and we're going to want to make sure that our code is dry, it's following good design, and you know that it's good clean code. So let's get started with this. So one, we're going to look for all inputs inside of the form. And there's actually one big thing that I missed here. We're using, if you take a look at this options object, this contains all of the classes and selectors that we're going to be using. So for example, I should have done this. I should have done I should have done options dot form selector, because that contains the class to select the forms. This is a great habit to get into, because we're going to need some of these selectors, and we're going to need to add and remove some of these classes many times. By simply adding it into an object or some type of variable, but adding it somewhere and then referencing it, one, it makes our code dry, we're not repeating ourselves, and also when we have hard-coded strings like this, it's great for more reasons than one. I didn't want to do that. It's great for more reasons than one. One, because you get it really lowers the margin of error as far as typos. Because for example, as soon as I type options, right, it lets me know if I go pop up. Usually it gives me. Usually the IntelliSense kicks in and gives me suggestions. Alright, what is it? Form. Alright, yeah, here it is. I was selecting the wrong one. Form selector. Right, so I get that auto correction, and if I need to change this class for any reason, I change it in one spot, and the rest of my code is good to go. So do make sure that you're using that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look for all the inputs inside the form. I'm going to contain all of this code inside of another function, set event listeners. So I'm going to call this here set event listeners, and I'm going to pass in a few things here. I'm going to pass in form element, and I'm going to pass in the options object here, because I'm going to need this information. Just give me one moment. Alright, I am back. I think my I didn't take my allergy medicine. I think my allergies are kicking in. But anyway, so we got our set event listeners here, and we want to pass in the form. I named this wrong. Form element and options. So this function. So take a look at what's going on here. So we're calling enable validation. It's going through all the forms. It's finding them, and setting this event listener just as a fail safe in case we don't already have it, which we do. And then it's going to call this function, and this function is pretty much going to do the bulk of the work, and it's also going to call other functions that it needs in order to do that as well. So this is a great function because I can set the event listeners for all of any form by simply passing in the form and passing in this options object. So I need to bring that in, and so I'm going to call it the same thing for the sake of simplicity. Form L and options. and now I have access to everything I need here. So what I want to do inside of form L is I want to search for all the inputs inside of there. And to do that, I can use pretty much the same code here. So instead of form elements, I'm looking for input elements. I'm going to call it input Ls. And instead of searching the entire document, all I have to do is search inside of this individual form to find all of the inputs. So I can do form L, query selector all. So when I do form L, what that, if query selector all on form L, what that's doing is it's grabbing, all right, so let's say this form here, this is one of them, it's looking inside of all of these, looking for these elements. So I'm searching only here, and this is limiting my my search. And this is great because all I have to do is search for this class, right? Pop up input. And if I were to search the entire document for pop up input, I'm going to find 4 because we have 4 of these. But I'm only looking inside of this form. So this is an important step. And I don't need to hard code pop up input because I get that right here. So I need options.inputSelector. I'm going to use one more technique here, and this is what I was referring to as object destructuring. So object destructuring, it's a way for us, it's what's called syntactic sugar. So it doesn't really add new features to JavaScript. So this is something new in JavaScript, in ES6 that came out, I think it was 2016. But it's still considered newer, even though it's been quite a few years. But this, because it takes a while for the browsers to actually accept it. At this point, they pretty much are all compatible with it. Um, but what this allows us to do is it's syntactic sugar and allows us pretty much just an easier way to write options dot form. What are we looking for? Input selector. So I can do this, right? I can come here and write options.inputSelector, and that's going to work just fine. But there's an easier way I can do this. I can simply go and set a variable equal to options. But if you notice, I didn't add a name here. So var name would go here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up brackets, and I'm going to put in the name of the property that I want to pluck off, and that's input selector. So all this is going to do is create a variable called input selector and set it to the property of input selector on this object. So to make this clearer, take a look, well, let's do this. These 2 lines of code are the same exact thing. This is creating a variable called input selector set to options.inputSelector, and this is creating a variable called input selector set to options.inputSelector. Same exact thing, just a different way of writing it. And I'm going to use that here so that all I have to do is write input selector. This is kind of developer preference. Like I said, it's called syntactic sugar because it's just a different way of writing things syntactically that makes it a little bit more readable, especially once you get used to it. So it's developer preference, but I really suggest that you get used to it because once we get into React, this is going to be used everywhere, and it's almost not an option. So do make sure that you're getting used to object destructuring, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it as we continue forward. Alright, so we got all of our input elements, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to log input elements, and I just want to make sure that we're actually collecting them. So if I come here, you see that it is working. So enable validation is running, we're looping through all of these, we're calling site event listeners, we're looking for all the inputs, and we're logging them. And we're getting 2 groups of 2 inputs, and that's exactly what we're expecting. Awesome. Now, what we can do is now that we've collected all of the inputs, now we need to loop through each one of the inputs, and we have to listen for an event. And what event is that? Take a look at our finished project, and one thing to note, and this is a project feature. If you notice, this validation is happening in real time, and what I mean by that is it's happening as soon as the user puts an input in. So take for example, if I delete that, as soon as I do, it tells me that that field is not valid. Still, it's not valid because you see the message, it has to be 2 characters or more. As soon as I add 2 characters, it's valid. From personal experience, you may realize that you may have noticed when using other forms that sometimes you'll type, right? And then you don't realize until you click out that then as soon as you click out, as you unfocus from the input, that's when the validation code runs, and it'll tell you whether or not it's valid. And if it has really bad UI, it won't tell you until you actually try to submit. And you got to go back through all this. Usually if you're using a government website, this is kind of what you're dealing with. They always have terrible UX and UI. But we're doing it in real time. Me personally, I'm actually a bigger fan of when you click out of it, but we're gonna do it real time. So we have to figure out. So essentially, what we have to do is we have to run the code. We have to check the validation each time the user makes an input into this input element. So now that we've collected all of the input elements, we have to go ahead and add an event listener, and we can finally get started with capturing that moment in time where the user actually inputs something into that input element. How do we do this? One, we know that we're going to have to loop through each one of these. Input L. And what are we going to do? We're going to go to input. Nope, it's not that. Input L. We're going to add an event listener. But what event are we looking for? How do we do this? Let me pull this back over here and let's do some research. And let's say, let's search for something here. Let's say, what would be a good search if we're trying to figure out how to do this? What would you guys suggest? What would you guys search up? So we're trying to find the input. We're trying to find the event that happens when a user inputs or types. What do you guys think?
I say something just like what you said. Input or event listener for input or typing.
For typing, let's put in input. Alright, and if we look here, we got a first list here, and this is the input event, which sounds like it would work. The input event fires when the value of the input element has been changed. And how do we use it? Okay, so we simply just grab the input. Alright, add the input, add event listener, and update, then we pass in the handler. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's give it a shot. So let's call it input, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a console.log because we want to make sure that this runs. So let's put input ran. Alright, so we get nothing off the bat, of course. So let's go ahead and try to make this work. So if I come here and I type something, let's take a look. Alright, and we're getting it. Input ran. Alright, awesome. And every time I type, it happens. Now, just out of curiosity, well, actually, let's not do that. There is also another, if you want to do some research, there's also another event called change. Usually what I do is try that one first and then define input, but we got a good search from Shaheen, which gave us exactly what we were looking for. So let's go to input and let's change this to change. I believe that's what it was. And let's see how that one's different. So if I type on it, right, I'm typing, and notice that nothing's happening. But as soon as I click out of it, that's when this event runs. So this is the event that is probably happening on other sites. Like, for example, as soon as I get here, it's not valid, and I click out, that's when it would tell me, hey, maybe your password doesn't have enough symbols or number, something along those lines. So it's just a great, I like to show it because it's a correlation between, probably in UX that you guys have, have already experienced personally, and now you guys are building it. But we're going to stick for the project requirements, and we're going to use input. So let's go ahead and make this a full arrow function, and let's start typing some code. So now that we're going to run through each one of these inputs, how are we going to actually determine whether or not this input is valid every time that we go ahead and we type into it? We're going to have to call a, one second here. We have to structure this code in a certain way. So I just have to take a look at the solution, at the example code for a second. Let's try. check it, show input error. Where am I at here? Okay, there we go. So what we can do is we're going to use the browser's API to go ahead and check whether or not this input is valid. So of course we're going to get the input element here. So we're going to do some operations on this input element. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to log it. We're going to log input L. And let's see what it logs when we type. So we see that we get an input event, and this is actually incorrect. This is not the input element. This is the event. So let me rename that accordingly. And let's see what we get in the event. So if I come here, we get some cool information about this event. But one thing that we get, of course, is the target. Now the target, it's funny though that e.target is equal to the element that this event was fired on, which is the input element. So e.target is the same thing as input L. So if I log input L and e.target, they're going to give me a reference to the same exact element in time. But I do want to log input L because that's actually what I wanted. So let's go ahead and log that, and let's see what comes up when we do it. So we see we get the representation of the actual HTML, but I want to see what methods are available to me on this element, because it is an input element, so an HTML element. So if you notice, remember before on elements we get a method like prepend, right, that allows us to add another element inside of it, or append, and first element child, and clone node, right? These are kind of tool sets. We'll talk more about how we get them, but these are tool sets that we get on certain data structures. So on input element, I want to see a list of them, so I'm going to use a different log of console.dir, and this is going to log it in a different way. And so I want to get the log of that again, but if you notice, if I click on this arrow, it's going to give me all the properties that are on here. And we're going to zone in specifically into one all the way down at the end here, and that is validity. And on this validity, it gives me a flag, a variable, another property with a Boolean value of true or false. So right now it's telling me that it's true. What about if I clear it out? What is it telling me now? So again, this is running, is this valid? And you see it's still true. So you may have been expecting for this to be false, right? Because it doesn't fit our requirements. But our code actually doesn't yet know our requirements for these inputs. So how is it that we do this? One, I want to clear up that you may have been expecting us to do something like this, right? Maybe you're expecting us to do input L.value, right? Because that gives us the value. And you may have said, okay, so if input L.value.length, this is going to give us the length of the value, is let's say less than is less than 2, well then this is invalid, do something here. So we would be checking the requirements specifically and manually is what I mean. But if you remember, in the project instructions, it tells us to use the browser messaging as well. So this is going to be difficult because, one, we have to check if it's the right length, and if it's not the right length, then we have to add the class, show the error message, and also write the error message based on whatever it is. Same thing for if it's empty, then we would have to write another message for if it's empty. For the URL, we would have to write whether or not it's a valid URL. We have to tell them, okay, it's empty, add a URL. And if it's not a valid URL, there's a lot of edge cases that we have to do for ourselves. But the browser provides for us an API. It provides for us a way, an interface, for us to add requirements in a more declarative way onto this input, and the browser will do the calculations. It will run the logic for us to tell us and simply tell us whether or not it's valid. But we have to tell it what our requirements for that input is. And where do we do that? We actually do that inside of the HTML. And if we come to this input, so let's do our first, let's first look at our requirements here. And our requirements for the first input name is between 2 and 40, and it's required. And so the way we can do this is by coming to our HTML and going to our name, and we're going to add an attribute here called required. And as soon as we do that, if we were not preventing default, the browser would not let us, it wouldn't let us submit it if it was required. And it's going to give us a really ugly message here. It may already do it. No, because we're preventing the default, we don't get the browser message that comes up that Chrome gives you by default, and that's good. We don't want that because we really don't want browser styling messages. We want to stay away from that. But we can grab that message programmatically. So let's add those requirements here. So let's add for the name. Again, it's between 2 and 40. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a max length of 40, and you guessed it, a min length of 2. And take a look at what we're going to see here. So let me type something here, and if we come down to this actually let's do this. Instead of logging this entire thing, I'm instead going to log input L dot validity. Whoops, let me actually log it. Input L dot validity, and we're gonna log the validity each time an input happens. Bam. What is the validity? Valid, true. Alright, because we're between 2 and 40. What if I delete it? Alright, so it's empty and it's still valid. That shouldn't be happening. Let's see why it is. So we have a minimum length of 2 and a max length of 4. Let's look at HTML max.
I think you added it to the card.
Did I add it to the wrong one?
And not the profile form.
Yeah, you're right. I added it to new card form. You're absolutely right. So let's go to the correct pop-up this time. Thank you, Shaheen. Alright, so owner name, yeah, here's what we're looking for. So between 2 and 40. And let's see. Let's see if we got it this time. Alright, so 1, it is valid. And if I delete it, it is false. It is not valid. And one thing that we're also looking for here is the error message. And where do we actually get that? I don't know why they did this, but you figure, so if you notice, on an input element, we get a property called validity, which leads us to another object with these properties. So validity.valid is pretty much the money right there. That is exactly what we're looking for. So false, right, because it's 1. True because it's 2. And the browser actually won't let us type more than 40. So we'll never see it false because it's over 40. But this gives us what we want. But we still want to find the error message. And I don't know why they chose to do this in the browser, but they didn't put the error message inside of the validity object. You get the error message on the input itself. It's just a top level property. So there's no error message. As soon as I delete it though, we get the error message, please fill out this field. And that's exactly what we want here. So now that we know exactly how to grab all the information, now we just have to go ahead and wire it all together. So here is where we want to go to the input. Here's where we actually want to go to the actual input error message element and add that error message. So let's go ahead and we have to actually define that here. And like I said, I'm not going to go over the styles, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy and paste that element here. So I know that I put it right here. That's how the styles are set up. It's a span, and I give it a class, what do I call it? Pop-up error. And that's going to bring in the styles that I need. And I'm going to leave it completely empty. And let's go ahead and just test out those styles. Which pop-up am I dealing with here? This is new card form. I did it again. Let's come here to... Let's come here and... Okay, looks like I already had it. I guess I did it right. Yeah, alright. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at it. So, of course it's empty. Nothing's in there. But if I come here and let's add some text inside of here. And I'm going to just say error message here. And it's not showing. I think I might have added it in the wrong spot. It is pop-up error. That is color. Okay, so we have to change that as well. So we have to add a class that brings it in. That's a little weird. I don't think you actually have to do that. All right, but anyway, as soon as I take the opacity 0 off, it shows us there. So it's already styled. And on input, if you add the error class, so let's find this error class. So pop up input type error. If we add that class here, what does it look like? See the bottom turns red, so the border turns red. So it's pretty evident that there is an error message. So obviously we want to do this programmatically, add the error class, and also add the error message programmatically as well. So let's do just that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to break that logic out into another function called show input error. And I'm also going to use another function here called function check input validity. And this is what's going to be in charge of checking the actual validity of the input. So I'm going to call this here check input validity, and I'm going to pass in what I need. I need form selector. I need the form element, because I'm going to need to access the form element again. And I also am going to need options, and of course I need the input element that we're dealing with. So I'm going to pass them in. So first is the form, next is the input, and next is the options. I'm going to simply copy and paste that to make sure that I don't confuse them. And let's go ahead and get started. So one, we're going to check the validity. So if input L, so remember this is going to run every single time a user puts an input into it. This is going to run once for each input. When the input types in that input. When the user types in that input. So input element dot validity dot valid. Remember, that's what gives us a Boolean value. So if it's not valid, so putting this exclamation point, I go ahead and I negate whatever I put in here. So obviously this is simply going to bring it back true or false, which works perfectly. But if it's not true, I want this code to run. So if it's not true, I want to show the input error. And I have to pass in, what do I have to pass in here? What do they want you to pass in here? Well, one, I need the form element again. And this is going to be a little bit tricky as to why. I need the input element that we're dealing with. And I do need to access the selectors and classes on the options object. So if that is true, I'm going to call that. And I am also going to use else here. So else we're going to hide input error. And this is important because if we simply leave it here, so if we only check if there's an error and then show it and then show the error, then we're never checking to if we're supposed to actually remove that error. So when the user actually fixes it, we have to put code here, this else, to make sure if there's not an error that we just simply remove it. So hide input error. So we're actually going to need the same information in order to do this. So we're going to pass in the same exact things here. So what is going to happen inside of show input error? We're going to bring in these here. So form element, how are we going to actually show the error? So we're left with a little bit of a challenge here. Because one, we have the form element, we have the input element, but how do we actually find how do we find the error? We can't do this, right? So we can't say input message, so let's say input, let's say error message L. We can't do document.querySelector and just put in, or what is it even? Here it is, pop-up error. Does anyone know why we can't do this? So take a look at how it's working. I see a chat there. All right. No problem, Shaheen. Great. I'll make sure to post a recording. Thanks for joining. So does anyone know why this is? Why we can't use document.querySelector here? Why can't we use that? So if you think about it, we have to show the error. So take a look at the finished product. So right now we have an error on this input. So we have to find this error message span that corresponds to this input. Because each one of these inputs, so if we go back to our HTML, each one of these inputs are going to have their own little element here, this little error message, in order to populate and show when we get an error. So we have to find the element that corresponds to this input, and that's hard because it's at the same level. We can't search inside of input because it's not inside of it. It's really next to it. But we can't even rely to its location within the DOM. This is never good to do because let's say for some reason we're gonna have like pop up, error, wrapper, right? And then we do something like this for maybe we have to change the design or something and we need a wrapper. Well, then if we're looking for whatever element is next to it, that's gonna break it. So we don't want to rely on the location. We do want to make sure that we're grabbing that one specifically. So how do we do that? Does anyone have any ideas? You can tell me no. Any ideas? All right, I'm going to take that as a no. So, so what we can do here is take a look at the information that's available to us here. One is we have the form element. So we talked about that we can narrow down the ones that we're looking for, but still we're left with two pop-up errors. So we need to know which one which one we're looking for. So this is one of those areas, like I said, there's a lot of thinking that goes on here and a lot of designing, right? So not design as in graphic design, because that's usually what people think of, but designing as the actual pattern and the structure of what we're doing. And so how can we, using the information that we're given at this moment in time, how do we find this span? Here's what we can do. Notice that each one of the inputs have an ID. So this input has an ID of owner name. This input has an ID of owner description. And we have the input element right here. So let's get rid of that for now. Let's comment it out. Let's log input L.id. So when we actually get an error, at that moment in time, we have available to us the ID. So what we can do is we can go to this span and we can give this span an ID based off of this ID. But we're going to use a very specific pattern here. We're going to call this owner. We're going to just copy and paste it. Whoops. We're going to copy and paste this ID, owner name, and we're going to prefix it, suffix it with a dash error. So what we can do is if we follow this pattern throughout our HTML, what we can do is, because at this moment in time we have access to the ID, we can simply grab the ID and just add hyphen error onto it, and that query select for that ID, and it's going to give us the span, that the pop-up error that corresponds to that input element. So let's give it a try. So instead of we can still search within the form element. It actually doesn't matter because the ID is going to be unique, so it really doesn't matter. But we're going to do it just because we have it. And what we're going to do here is we're going to search for the ID. So I have to give it the hashtag. I'm going to add input. I'm going to add the ID input l.id plus slash error. So what does this equal? So actually, before we even run it, let's console.log that string that we're constructing here. So hashtag, right, for the ID plus the input element.id, which will be owner name in this case, dash error. So we should get that as soon as we have an error. And that is what we get. So all we have, so as we're constructing this string, all we have to do is add that, is select for that. And this right here is going to change each time, because based on the input that we're validating, analyzing at that moment, we're going to pull the ID off of that input. So what we're going to do is add that into here. But there's one more way we can refactor this. Instead of using the plus signs here to build this string, we can use template literals. So if you look at the tilde on the N in Spanish, or that little accent, it's actually a different type of quotation. It's usually referred to as tick marks. And it's usually above the tab and below the escape on your keyboard. So if you use that, it creates the same thing. It's called a template string. It's still a string, but it allows us to put variables inside of it. And so what we can do is type this hashtag, and now that we need to add the input element ID, we can simply write a $ and open up these brackets, and that allows us to add an expression here, and it allows us to add input.id. And now with the error, I no longer have to break out of the string, add a plus, and then add another string. I can simply just continue typing the string. So it's a little bit easier to read, especially because sometimes these string builds can go long. And if you notice, I'm getting the same thing. So I'm building that string just in a different way. So if I come here, and I'm going to grab that piece of code, and now I'm going to search for that, and let's log it again, just to make sure that at this moment in time we're grabbing the correct error message. Let's make sure that it's at least not undefined. And if you notice, there I am grabbing pop-up error, owner name error. And what if, let's go ahead and add the requirements for the next one, and let's test that one out as well. So the about field required between 2 and 200. So I'm just simply going to copy and paste what I have here. These three, I'm going to add it here. So it's required between 2 and 200. So let's see if that works. So, alright, so I'm getting pop-up error for owner name error. And did I add the span? I didn't add the ID. So the ID of this one should be similar to this, but with dash error. We have to follow the same pattern. Let's make sure it is correct. Bam, we got owner name error. And bam, we got owner description error. So that is how we're going to find the correct input here. So all we need to do now is, first off, when we're showing the input error, we have to add the class to the input element. So we have that available to us here, input element dot class list dot add, and we're adding, what are we adding here? We're adding input error class. So I can use options dot input error class. That's going to work just fine. But again, there's something I can do here. Again, that's it has to do with object destructuring. And if you remember, I can do this, right? So I can create input error class. I'm going to create a variable called input error class by using object destructuring and pulling it off of options. So this is the same exact thing as to what as just doing this, right? Options dot input error class, right? Same thing. But I can make this even a little bit easier for myself. I'm actually, for right now, this is the only thing I'm going to use off of options. So I can actually destructure it straight from this parameter here. And this is something you're going to see very often moving forward, especially when we get to React. And the way that looks is the same exact way. We're going to use brackets, but we're going to pull off input error class. And what this is going to do is it's expecting, we know that we're expecting an object here with a property of input error class. So all we're doing here is grabbing that object. We don't care about the rest of the properties. We're just pulling off input error class. And we're going to use that right here. Input error class. So if you saw, I showed pretty much 3 ways that we could have done this. I could have done options.input error class. You know, I could have destructured it inside of the function, but I destructured it inside of the parameters. Like I said, just get used to that because we're going to be using that a lot going forward. So I got the class added that makes it red. And I have to go to the error message element, and I have to change the text content, just like we did in profile, to the error message. And I get that from input L dot validation. Is it validation message? Yes, validation message. And I also have to add error class. That this makes it visible. I don't really see that. I don't see a. It's not really an event that needs to fade in, but I guess they wanted to do that here. So we're going to fade in the error message by adding this class, error message L dot class list dot add error class. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back and I'm going to destructure error class as well. And there we go. So let's see if this works. So we're not going to be able to hide it yet, but let's see if this works. So if I go ahead and delete this, awesome, and we can see that it works. My border is now red, so we're adding the error class to the input, and our message is there as well. What if I type just one character? Oh, and we see that our message changes as well. Awesome, and that's exactly what we want. Now, one thing I want to point out is take a look at the message that's here. Remember that we didn't have to manually write out the logic of how many characters are there. Is it a URL? When we get into an email, is it a valid email? We don't have to write that logic. The browser does it for us. There's a little bit of a caveat to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Safari. I'm going to come to my project. And let's see how it works here. So I'm going to remove it, and I get fill out this field. And if you see when I type 1, I get an error message, and it conveys the same message, but the error message is different. What does that tell you? Remember that this logic is given to us by the browser. We don't know which browser our user is going to be using. So if this was an enterprise level, project, if this was something that's going to reach a lot of people, a lot of users, I wouldn't, it's not good practice to rely on the browser to do this logic for you, because it's going to change from browser to browser. Usually you would use, you also wouldn't write out the validation manually either. That's rarely done, because there's a lot of libraries and frameworks that do it for you. So that's probably what you would be doing, and the frameworks don't change because that's part of your code base. So that's I just say that because in the real world, you probably wouldn't use this type of validation. You probably use another type, but the concept is still exactly the same. You're just using the browsers in this case. So I just like to show that you know it is a little different, and the code, the logic comes from the browser. But we don't have to type it ourselves, and it's fine for this project, and it's great to know that it's there because we can definitely use it on our side projects as well. And who knows, maybe some company out there does use it, no big deal. So we got that, and we also need to hide it too. So as soon as I come here and I type 2, this error message should go away, and I need hide input error to handle that for me. Hide input error is going to be very similar to show input error, so I'm just going to simply copy it down, call it hide input error, and I need to find the error message in the same way, but except I'm going to remove the class. The text content, I'm going to set that to nothing, and I'm going to remove that error class as well. Let's see if that works for us. Alright, we're getting an error, still getting an error. We shouldn't get an error now. Awesome. And it comes back. Awesome. So we got that done exactly correctly. And the same concept applies to here. Pretty much just adding the correct spans. But it would work the same way, because remember we're collecting that form as well. We just didn't set up the spans and the requirements. You guys can do that when you get there. The last thing to do is, if you notice, one thing that we're missing here is the button. Is we're not actually toggling the button. So we should toggle the button based on whether or not all of our inputs are valid. So we have to make another check here. So this is our last piece here, and that's toggle button state. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another function here called toggle button state. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in all of our input elements and our form element. Actually, it's going to take in our button. So what I'm going to do here, because this function is getting run one time per form, I'm going to find the button here. So I'm going to find submit button, and I'm going to set that equal to form L dot query selector. I think you can hear my neighbors throwing off firecrackers. Let's see. What is this button called? Pop-up button. Alright, so let's do that. And it's a class. Make sure to put that dot there. And it is a const. And we are going to pass that into toggle button state. So submit button. And let's create this function again. Function toggle button state, and let's bring in those parameters of input else and submit button. Now what we want to do here is we want to look through all of these input elements, and we want to check the validity of all of them. And what we want to say is, if there's just one invalid input, disable the button. If they're all valid, or in other words, if we can't find one invalid input, make sure that the button is enabled. So again, remember that this function is going to run each time, right, the user clicks inside and inputs inside of that input. So we're going to run this logic each time. So what we're going to do, what we can do is say input else dot for each input, and we're going to add a variable up here called const found invalid equals false. So what we're going to do is inside of here, whoops, inside of here, we're going to loop through all of them. We're going to check the validity, and if the validity, if even just one of them is invalid, we're going to set this to true. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to say input L dot validity dot valid. I have to put this inside of an if statement. So if input L dot validity dot valid, if not, because if it's false, then I'm going to set found invalid to true. And so down here, after all of that code runs, what I'm going to say down here is I'm going to say if found invalid. So what's going on here? I'm setting this to false, and then I'm looping through each one of them. If I find one that's invalid, I'm going to set found invalid to true. So now down here, after I loop through everything, I'm going to say if I found an invalid one, I'm going to go to the submit button. Whoops. I'm going to go to the submit button, and I'm going to make sure that it is disabled. And so how do I do that? What class do I have here? Inactive button class. I'm going to add that class to the button. Submit button at classlist.add. Actually, don't need to do that. I need to pull in options. Okay, so I don't have that available to me here. I didn't pass it in, so I have to make sure that I do that. So I'm going to pass in options. And again, what class do I need here? Only inactive button class. So I can only pass in that class, but I'm just going to pass in everything and then just pull off what I need. So toggle button state. Alright, I'm pulling in a third parameter here, and I'm pulling off inactive button class, and I'm going to use it here. If not, so else submit button dot class list dot remove inactive button class. So, and one thing I wanted to do as well is I also want to add the disabled property. This is good for the browser, just because so that the browser also knows that this button is disabled, so it won't let you click on it. So submit button dot disabled equals true, and whoops, and down here I'm going to set that to false. So let's see if that works. So when I open this up, looks like it's not assignment to constant variable 31. Yes, this can change, so this should be a let. So let's open that up. And as you can see, as soon as I make this invalid, it goes to disabled. Now, one thing that's hard is when it originally opens, it may not work, and I believe that that's okay. So for example, when I open it, alright, so well actually it's allowing me to submit it. It should work. And so, for example, this add new place, right? These are not valid. So it takes for that event to happen for it to go ahead and check whether or not this should be disabled. So the one thing easiest to do is for the new card pop-up is to simply just make it disabled from the beginning. So if I go to this button, I can make it disabled and also add the disabled class. So I'm making it disabled by default, and this is okay because as soon as it's open, it's always going to be empty, right? So as soon as this is open, it's always going to be empty. But my enable button looks like it's not working. A submit button that disables equals false. So if found invalid, right, it should be adding the inactive class, and if it didn't, it should be removing it. No, that's correct, because they're still not both valid. But I'm getting errors. Validation.js 14 cannot set properties of null. So whatever it's looking for isn't being found. Error message L. Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't add the spans here. Okay, that's fine. As soon as you guys add the spans, it will work. But this video is running pretty long, so I don't want to go into that as well. The last thing I want to do is I'm going to refactor this code a smidge. One, I prefer not to use else. I think I talked about this before, but using else kind of makes your code a little bit messy. And the way that you can defer from using else is by simply returning. So if I found invalid, I'm going to return from this if statement. So if this runs, this never runs. If this doesn't run, this runs. So it's pretty much the same thing, but it's a little bit cleaner. I can do the same thing up here. So I can return from this function, so it's done as soon as this code runs. So if it's invalid, it will show the input error, and that's it. If it's not, it will hide the input error. I can make this again. Whoops. I can make this again cleaner. One, this code, it's not bad, but it can be a heck of a lot easier. Why is that? One thing we get in JavaScript, again, remember that we get methods on these arrays. And one thing that we get is a method called every. And what this does, it says that every method tests whether all elements in the array pass the test implemented by the function. It returns a Boolean value. So take a look at what's going on here. It says they have a function here called isBelowThreshold, and that this function is being passed into every. So it's just like for each. You pass it a function, except it's called every. It takes in that element in the array, just like the for each, so the current value. And then what they're doing here is they're returning the result of this calculation here. So if this number, so if 1, 30, 39, so each one is going to run once for each one of these numbers. If it's below, if it's less than 40, then it will return true, and if not, it will return false. So in order for this piece of code to return true, each one of these have to return false. True. If just one returns false, well then then it returns false. So this kind of does this work for us. So you see how we had to add a flag up here and then go through all of them and then check whether or not. This code can look just like this. First off, I'm going to take this. I'm going to take this logic and I'm going to move it into its own function. So I'm going to call it function check input. I'm going to call has invalid input. This is a naming convention for variables when it returns a Boolean. You put has before and it'll tell you whether or not. It pretty much denotes that you're looking for something in the list. So we're going to pass in the input elements, so the input list. So I'm actually going to call it input list. And all I can do here is I can return input list.every. Now remember, this piece of code is only going to return true if every single item in this array returns true for whatever calculation I give it. So here's where I define that function. So I'm going to call this input L, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to return whether input L dot validity dot valid. So this in itself is going to return true or false based on whether or not it is it is valid. So what's going on here is I can call this function. This is actually input list. So on input list, I'm calling every, and I'm checking whether every single input is valid. And if you think about it, though, if every input is valid, this is going to return true. And that's good. It's doing what we want, but take a look at how the function is named. It's called has invalid input. So if every single item passes this calculation, then it actually should return false. So I'm actually going to add that exclamation point to simply just reverse whatever comes back. So if this returns true, so everything passed, it's going to return false because it doesn't have an invalid input. So some students choose to go for has valid input, and they simply just negate the logic. So I guess it depends on if you're a half glass full or a half glass empty type person. But we're searching for if it's invalid or if it's valid. In this case, we're checking if it has one invalid input. So all I have to do here is instead of using that flag, I can type in has invalid input and passing the input elements, which is the input list. So what's going to happen here is it's going to run that function, has invalid input, and if just one of them is invalid, this is going to return true because it does have an invalid input, and we're going to run this code. All right. And if not, then we're going to disable. And let's just check to make sure that it works. So let's go ahead and delete. Awesome. Awesome, and everything is working completely fine. One last thing that I'm going to leave this for you guys to do is move this into its own function as well. So you should have two more functions here. So disable button and enable button. And what this should do is simply add the class to disable it, and add the disabled attribute, and also remove it as well. So this is there's a lot of new things presented in this project. So this live coding always goes pretty long, as you can see. So let me ask you guys: do you guys have any questions?
Not at this moment.
All right, awesome. And what about you, Larry? Alright, I guess Larry's all good. So alright, awesome. So I'll go ahead and end the recording here, and I'll be posting it soon, as soon as it processes. And if any questions, just let me know. And one last thing, please note that I didn't touch on the escape and the overlay click. So that is a JavaScript portion left for you guys. So just keep that in mind as well. Alright, awesome guys. So I'll be posting this recording. I'll see you guys in Slack.